Hello and welcome to CINTEGRITY's Cultural Decay series. I'm your host and founder of CINTEGRITY Media, Cory Stillman, back today with another episode of our conversation around cultural decay and where we are at as a culture, what we have lost, where we have been, where we are going, so on and so forth. I wanted to kind of take stock with today's episode because I sort of imagine, if you follow film at all, and I imagine if you're listening to this, then you do to some regard. If you follow the world of film, you probably know we're at a bit of a pivot in the year 2026. And what I mean by that is that we have Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey finally with us. It is in theaters, it is available to audiences. People are seeing it. I am not one of those people. Sadly, I wish I was. Alas, I live here in Los Angeles where it is very, very difficult to get a ticket to the film, particularly if you want to see it in 70 millimeter IMAX. I work in this industry. I work as a publicist for behind the camera talent. You would think I could pull some strings, have some connections to get into that Universal City Walk a bit earlier than some others. But that is not the case. And so I cannot talk to you about Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey in today's episode. That is the film I would love to discuss with you all. I hope after I see it, it is ripe with ideas around cultural decay. After all, what better way to tell us about where we are at as a culture today, where we have been as a culture, than a film recapturing, the original story, one of the original hero's journeys as we know it. And if I know Nolan like I think I do, he's a guy that is very interested in storytelling, in fiction, and what it says about where we're at today. And so I do hope very much so to deliver an episode of Cultural Decay about Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. But I like I said, I think that film kind of puts us at a bit of a pivot point in the year. It's getting rave reviews. I always knew it would. I had never doubted my good friend Christopher Nolan for a second. So we'll certainly talk about him, I promise. But with that, we have to kind of put the first half of the year to rest. And how would you define the first half of 2026 in film? I would define it with a film that we've talked about ad nauseum here on Cultural Decay, a film that very few other scholars or cinephiles or analysts or whatever you want to call them would probably use to define the first half of 2026. That film, of course, is Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day. Not only do I think it is the best film of the year so far, but I do think it is the film that most directly taps into the cultural zeitgeist. And so, yes, I'm going to reference back to that film just a couple more times in today's episode. But I want to sort of treat this first batch of episodes. This is our fifth episode of the Cultural Decay series. I think of that as something of a milestone when you're me and you're just starting this thing out and you're not sure how far you're going to get. Any remotely nice, clean number feels promising. And so five is our first of a bunch of milestones ahead, I'm sure. I want to contextualize Disclosure Day just a bit more, having run through some other films and some other topics that I think are relevant to it. We talked about Nope in our immediate follow up to that episode because I do think those films are very, very closely related. We talked about Ari Aster's Eddington and what it has to say about the monoculture and our most obvious example of a shared experience in recent memory, the COVID-19 pandemic. We took a little bit of a detour to talk about Minions and Monsters. I want this series in general to remain relevant, right, to recent releases. And so, I mentioned Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. I hope, as much as I like to reference back to old films, that we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss new ones as well. But I hope you can view these first five episodes as a sort of collection about this first half of 2026, about Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day, and what it might have to say about the state of the monoculture, of mass culture as we know it today. What is that? I mean, please go back and listen to that first episode. It's funny. I have a lot of friends who are still seeing Disclosure Day and asking me questions about it, either based on that video or based on things they've seen on my letterbox, or just, me being the go-to cinephile in their lives, which I very much dearly appreciate. I've had a lot of people approach me with their thoughts on that film, asking if I liked it, asking what I think it means, asking, why it was so terrible. It wasn't, of course, but some people have the right to be wrong. I've learned that over time. I've had a lot of questions about it. And honestly, I'm almost tired of talking about it at a certain point. So when I find myself repeating some of the same things that I've written about for my Substack or talked to all of you about across these first several episodes, I feel myself getting a little drained by it. But this is the grind, right? I mean, this is the life we have chosen to sit here and to put it all on the line for all of you listening. And so I'm going to do it again, like I said, I'm going to do it at least once more here today. Who knows? Maybe the Odyssey won't grab me the way I hoped. Maybe the second half of 2026 will still feel defined in some way by Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day, because I do think that is a special film, and I think it has a lot that is going to really set the tone for this Cultural Decay series, however long it might run, and however long we need to think about pop culture, the American culture, global culture, the way it has faded, the way it has been redefined, the ways we have moved further away from one another than ever before. I think all of those things will continue to remain relevant and very much in the way that they are framed. Now, if you listened to that first episode, and like I said, please go back and give it a listen. I still think I'm really proud of that one. It's really only been downhill ever since. I think that we started with our best work. And so we're trying to just recapture that at some point. So if you want to see Syntegrity at its best, please go start with episode 1. If you listen to that first episode, very early on in it, I say Steven Spielberg has made an M. Night Shyamalan movie. What did I mean by that, right? It wasn't a twisty film the way we're used to from M. Night Shyamalan. It wasn't necessarily even all that grounded in some of like the strange sci-fi tropes that Shyamalan enjoys. I mean, Shyamalan has dealt with aliens as well in a movie like Signs. So it's not that couldn't have been in Shyamalan's territory. But what I really mean when I say that Disclosure Day is Steven Spielberg's take on an M. Night Shyamalan film is that there's an uncanniness to the whole thing. There's something just a little off about the movie in its dialogue, in its framing, in its editing. There's something just a little off kilter about every movie that M. Night Shyamalan makes. And I think that's what often alienates people from his movies. A lot of us are very divided on M. Night Shyamalan. I think he's kind of built a reputation as a bad filmmaker, in recent memory. He's one of my personal favorites, not just because he is a fellow Philly native, although that is certainly part of it, but also because I just think he is tapping into something really unique. I think he does really fun, interesting things with the camera. As we get into today's film, which I've buried the lead on for far too long, we can talk about some of the cool things I think he does with his camera and as a capital F filmmaker. But in general, I really enjoy him as a writer. I really enjoy the way he builds dialogue. No sentence ever really seems to follow the previous or have anything to do with the next. There's something just kind of off about his dialogue. But in that sense, it feels very authentic and real to me. I think it's very intentional, is what I want to be very clear about. Some people like to say that Shyamalan's not a great writer because it does feel so strange and kind of awkward to listen to. But that stilted kind of nature to it is very much by design. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, it's how a lot of us speak in our day to day. If you can't tell from the intermittent cuts, I find myself every once in a while saying the wrong thing here as I talk to all of you. Sometimes I get tripped over on a word or stuck, and I'm stumbling on a word or whatever it might be. This is how we speak, and that's not to say that his actors deliver such jumbled dialogue. They're still pretty clear and crisp in the way they speak, but they say things that are weird. They say things that, don't follow perfect sentence structure or don't feel all that at home in the context of the broader conversation. And that is ultimately how humans speak, especially in strange circumstances. And Shyamalan certainly puts his characters into plenty of strange circumstances, as he did in 2008's The Happening. That will be today's film, M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening, starring Mark Wahlberg and Zooey Deschanel, and John Leguizamo, who is in The Odyssey. So in some ways, we're doing some Odyssey prep already here by talking about The Happening. Now, I wanted to talk about this movie for a number of reasons. One, I think the movies I've discussed so far, Minions and Monsters notwithstanding, are pretty much agreed upon as good movies. It's funny I say that when I've talked about Disclosure Day being so divisive, but these are competent movies by competent directors, right? I think even Disclosure Day's biggest detractors would have to admit that there's a competence on display at the hands of Steven Spielberg. Nope is a divisive movie for maybe its content and some of its expectations relative to movies like Get Out and Us that Jordan Peele had made prior. But I think people can agree, pretty well made movie. Same goes for Eddington. Even detractors of that film are probably doing so based a little bit more on its content. The Happening is pretty much universally despised. This movie is very much considered a bad movie. I try not to refer back to Letterboxd too much when I do these things, but I think it has under a 2 on there. I believe it has like a 1.9 out of 5 as its average rating. That's pretty fucking bad. That's very low. And I think that movie often, if it wasn't The Last Airbender, which was certainly the nadir of M. Night Shyamalan's career, I think The Happening was very much the movie that kind of came along and made people start to sour on him a little bit and become a little skeptical of him as a filmmaker. I'm not one of those people, though. No, I love this movie. I think it's a very good movie. I think it's a very interesting movie, and it's very relevant to some of the things that we want to discuss here at CINTEGRITY Media as part of our Cultural Decay series. And in general, that is just something I hope to achieve with this series, is a kind of curatorial experience. I think I've alluded to this across a bunch of our episodes now, but I hope that this series can not just reinforce your love of new releases and of long-standing classics, but help you rediscover movies that you had maybe written off or just maybe had never seen at all. Maybe just help you view them in a new light. And maybe we can just start to develop a bit of our own unique sense of taste here at CINTEGRITY Media. And if you're going to be a fan of CINTEGRITY, you got to be a fan of M. Night Shyamalan. Like I said, we are loyal to our Philadelphia filmmakers here, but we are especially loyal to them when they are as innovative and as thoughtful as he is. And I really want to emphasize that word thoughtful, because I think, again, there's a belief that things that he does are not always intentional. They very much are. And his movies often have, at their core, a really big heart. They're often just built around notions of family or relationships. That's nothing new. A lot of films will treat those kinds of topics as their emotional cores. But as much as he likes to dress them up in these kind of B-movie, type premises, these are movies that have strong emotional cores. And so I do really think M. Night Shyamalan is a very thoughtful filmmaker. With that being said, I don't think the most interesting elements of The Happening are rooted in its emotional core, which of course is the relationship between Mark Wahlberg's Elliot and Zooey Deschanel's Alma. This is a married couple who are kind of staring down a crisis. Alma has grown increasingly distant. She's feeling a lot of guilt about a mostly innocent dessert she got with a coworker, Joey. Fun fact, Joey is actually voiced by M. Night Shyamalan, who appears in all of his movies, but in this case only is heard, never seen in The Happening, which that in and of itself might actually be kind of relevant to what this film is trying to achieve. The emotional core is that they might be getting a divorce. We're not really sure. All of that is kind of put on hold when something happens. And that's obvious, right? Something does indeed happen in The Happening. But I keep it that vague because I think the title, it keeps it that vague for good reason. We're never really sure what it is that happened in this movie. And a lot of theories are presented very early on. And this movie, I think, is very structurally clever. It opens with Mark Wahlberg's Elliot, who is a school teacher. Mark Wahlberg is actually pretty good in this movie. I think he's pretty good at nailing some of the more emotional beats. He's not our greatest actor, and I think he's certainly not believable as a high school teacher. But he is teaching a fun lesson to his students on bees, on a crisis facing honeybees in America and why so many of them are disappearing. And I wrote down some of the many reasons that his students guess this could be happening. Is it global warming? Is it pollution? Is it disease of some kind? No, it's none of those things. It's almost unexplainable, is what kind of the hot, cool kid in school who Elliot kind of picks on concludes. It's the laws of nature can never be fully understood. And that really is kind of the key to this entire movie. The idea that there are forces beyond our understanding. And those forces go beyond just the three that I just mentioned. Even as the film continues and what's happening to the bees is all of a sudden happening to humans. Essentially what it is that a unexplainable disease. Is it a disease? Again, I hesitate to even use that word, but some kind of affliction is going around the northeast of the United States, just the northeast, Pennsylvania, some of the neighboring areas, neighboring states, that is making people kill themselves. This is actually a pretty disturbing movie. This is M. Night Shyamalan's first foray into R-rated filmmaking. I think that's very relevant because he really does kind of go for it in certain sequences in terms of the gore and just some really upsetting imagery of people stabbing themselves, willingly driving their own cars into trees. It's truly disturbing stuff, and we can't really explain why. There are forces beyond our understanding. Again, people wonder, is this a terrorist attack of some kind? Is this the government or the CIA trying to pull something, specifically targeting the Northeast of the United States? Is this political in some way? It may be some combination of all of those things. It is never properly explained in the film, nor should it be. That is really kind of the crux of this entire movie, is that something is happening and we cannot explain why. Because sometimes things just happen. There's a lot of great lines of dialogue in this that, again, sound kind of unsatisfying and kind of awkward, which, again, I think is why this film never really got the love that it deserved, is that it's a kind of a thankless effort by M. Night to make a movie whose entire conclusion is, I can't explain it to you. I can't give you the answers. None of the characters in here can help you. Or, as an audience, no one is going to really satisfy you in any given way. So whenever Elliot, who is this science teacher, he has some level of insight on what is happening in the world. If this were to be pollution or disease of some kind, he probably would have some of the knowledge to help suss that out. When young Jess, John Leguizamo's daughter, who they have to bring with them, Elliot and Alma do, because John's Julian has actually very tragically passed away due to this affliction. When they have to bring Jess with them, she asks a lot of questions like any young girl would. And often Elliot's answer is, I honestly don't know. He repeats something similar to that very often over the course of this film. The very first line spoken in this film is by an unnamed character. She's kind of maybe one of the very first victims of the happening. And she just she's reading a book, right? She turns to her friend and says, I forgot where I am. It's really strange. It's really weird, right? And her friend somehow knows exactly where she is in the book, and she reminds her something like, you're at the part where the killer just did this. It's silly. It's weird. It's a lot of the things I said Disclosure Day was. Because, again, I do think that movie was very much tapping into a M. Night Shyamalan style of writing and tone. These are characters who just don't know things. And we as humans don't know things. Here I am trying to speak with some level of authority on this movie or maybe certain cultural or political developments. And I'll be the first to admit, I know shit. I really, I'm talking out of my ass half the time. I hope you enjoy what I have to say and pick up on some level of insider expertise here. But ultimately, most of us on this website, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Substack or your podcast provider, are people talking out of our asses. And so I hope you keep that in mind when you're even listening to some of the smartest folks that you listen to. Because we as humans don't know things. We don't. And we can't ever fully explain what is happening to us. And that is why I wanted to put this film into conversation with Disclosure Day. It is as a kind of rebuttal to what I keep hearing as the most glaring criticism of that film, which is kind of those last 15 to 20 minutes, the disclosure itself, right? The broadcast to the world. We talked about this, how people found that unrealistic. They didn't feel that it resonated with our reality. That's not how media works these days. That's not how information is disseminated. That's not how audiences would respond to it, yada, yada, yada. I still find that to be a very boring and unconvincing and just disappointing way to view this film and, quite frankly, to view the world. Because we can't always explain things. We can't always know what will or will not happen. Yes, it is true that that kind of brief moment of monoculture, of unity amongst the global population feels far-fetched. It feels far out of our grasp these days and the way we move through the world these days. I think I conceded that what Spielberg paints there is really not a reflection of our reality, but it is aspirational. I think it's worth being aspirational every now and then, especially in a world that, as the response to that moment has confirmed, is growing deeply, increasingly pessimistic. And so there's room for some optimism, right? I'm not sure that The Happening itself is all that optimistic film, but I think it's a film that is willing to admit that we don't always need all the answers. What we need is each other. And I think that, again, is kind of what Steven Spielberg is tapping into with Disclosure Day. Kind of the crowdsourcing of information in The Happening does lead to a lot of fun theories around what this movie is, what The Happening really is, right? I've already mentioned several. You know, People throw out kind of a lot of these like half-baked theories, right? When Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, obviously a lot of great Philadelphia references in this film, when that becomes sort of the second target of The Happening after Central Park in New York City, when that happens and Elliot learns it, he says, another park? So he's trying to create some sort of connection there. Maybe this is nature related in some way. Indeed, a lot of the shots of The Happening, as insofar as it can be captured, because again, this is not something tangible. It is not something you can look at or see or hold on to in any way, are just shots of the wind rustling grass and trees and plants and things like that. So we do know that M. Night is certainly interested in drawing some parallels between this film and environmental crises and global warming, which we referenced earlier. There's certainly a lot of the natural world on this film's mind. But that's not the only thing at play here. Again, it's the idea that there are forces beyond our understanding, which is often, I think, M. Night's whole deal. I think in all his movies, he sort of likes to posit that there may be things out there that we just cannot comprehend, that we cannot fully explain. And he kind of likes to, pull some trickery and some mindfuckery along the way. So I find that pretty fun. And I do want to circle back on that idea as we wrap up in a little bit, because I think that's an interesting counterbalance with Christopher Nolan and where we may be going as we move into the Odyssey in our next episode. So I mentioned a lot of sort of just empty shots in this movie, shots of empty fields where the wind is blowing. And you can understand that the wind in this case is The Happening. It's some kind of evil force, and the wind really becomes a character unto itself in this movie. I think M. Night captures it beautifully, quite frankly. I think if this is a really well shot and well edited movie, in the fact that the shot reverse shot can convey so much when there's quite literally just empty frames as a part of those shots. Even when we're focusing on a character's face, it's often with a very flat affect, and it's often not really directly responding to what came before it. Sort of like I said about the dialogue. We may be cutting between two characters the way we would in any given conversation, but we're not doing it in service of any real communication. And that's what I find really sort of sad about this movie, but in a really beautiful kind of way. It's a movie about how much we need each other, how much we need community, because we cannot fully comprehend the world around us. But it's also a movie that is worried that we may not have it, that we may not have each other's backs, that we may not fully understand each other, perhaps because we are so obsessed with fully understanding the world around us. A movie that I do hope to dive into a little deeper in a future episode that I think is very thematically similar to The Happening is Under the Silver Lake. Perhaps we'll talk about Under the Silver Lake as we get closer to David Robert Mitchell's next film, The End of Oak Street, which comes out next month in August. Really looking forward to that one. We'll see if that movie really is just a straight sort of like dinosaurs, sci-fi, horror kind of thing, or if it's as weird as we can often expect from David Robert Mitchell. His film Under the Silver Lake, yet another divisive film, but I think has developed a bit more of a cult following than maybe something like The Happening even has. But that's a movie about one man's search for meaning. He thinks he has discovered perhaps the key to all of pop culture. If I was Andrew Garfield in that movie, I would have think I stumbled upon a gold mine. He and I are likely very similar. I sit here and talk to all of you in search of answers, but he thinks he has found a shortcut. And so he goes on this sort of odyssey, if you will. Honestly, that the movie is, in a way, kind of its own riff on the Odyssey. Through the different back channels and underground areas of Los Angeles in search of sort of this cipher that could help him understand all of really American pop culture as we know it. But to spoil Under the Silver Lake for you, so please, keep in mind that there will be spoilers of any movie at any given time here at Sintegrity. Nothing is safe, quite frankly. We gotta just keep going. If we're gonna get the answers, we're gonna get there by any means necessary. There's no answer. There's no meaning. Nothing really has meaning is kind of the conclusion of Under the Silver Lake. It's funny that I can find that film so rich with meaning despite such a nihilist conclusion. Because I don't think the film is necessarily saying that we should all just stop thinking about and talking about these things. Maybe I just cope because if that's the case, then what the hell am I doing here? I think the film is saying that we kind of make our own meaning. And no one can give it to us. No one can force it upon us. And I've always felt that to be the case. It's why I will always be the first to admit that everything I proffer here are just my own ideas that I hope you resonate with to some extent. But I really always encourage you to share your own ideas. Let me know what you think about M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening. I just ask always that we are thinking, right? That the wheels are spinning and that we are interested in digging a little deeper into these movies. Because M. Night himself referred to The Happening as a kind of B movie. Most of his movies, like I said, do have these sort of B movie aspirations, but they ultimately have a lot more on their mind. And so it's okay if you watch The Happening and at first glance you're like, wow, what a stupid little sci-fi movie. But please just be open to the possibility that these things mean a little bit more. Like I said, it is a fun movie on its surface. Jeremy Strong shows up in it. I totally forgot, when I rewatched this, for all of you, I forgot Jeremy Strong was in this movie. He's doing like a southern accent despite being a member of the National Guard here in Pennsylvania. I guess it's not out of the realm of possibilities that he couldn't be some Georgian that was placed up there. But it's really funny to see Jeremy Strong show up and, of course, putting his whole ass into this performance the way he does. Kendall Roy, the way he will Mark Zuckerberg, the way that man will for any role given to him. So that's fun. There's fun elements of this movie that make it a fun little sci-fi romp. But ultimately, it's a movie that is concerned with our loss of a monoculture. Like I say, so many movies are these days. It's concerned that we have moved far away from one another in our attempts to kind of move into our specific causes, our specific disciplines, and arrive at answers. That's not to say that the pursuit of science isn't an important one. That's not to say the pursuit of politics or, national defense and all these things aren't increasingly crucial. Of course they are, but we can't silo anything off from one another. And we have all become increasingly siloed off from one another just via our phones and our devices and all the obvious reasons that we feel separated. But even there's something I think a little intellectual and maybe philosophical about the ways in which we have moved far away from each other as well. And way back in 2008, M. Night was concerned about that. And nearly 20 years later, it's only become more and more true. I really do recommend rewatching The Happening if you haven't watched it in the last decade or so, because I do think, especially in a post-pandemic world, it's a pretty uncanny watch. There's a lot, especially in the early going of that movie, where you're like, wow, this is super similar to what it was like when the pandemic first struck and we weren't really sure what was going on. And like Disclosure Day, this is a movie concerned with our capacity for belief. One of my favorite scenes in the film, and it kind of becomes a recurring motif throughout, is when Elliot is talking to Jess, trying to get her to open up, to calm down, after such tragedy has struck against her and her family. And he's showing her his mood ring. And he puts it on her, and it turns yellow. And he says, well, that means you're about to laugh. Oh my God, I guess you're probably going to laugh any second now. And of course, that's just the idea of that. He's kind of doing a good job of playing a sort of fatherly role towards her, maybe more of like an uncle role. I think she even calls him Uncle Elliot, actually. She starts laughing. And so just the very suggestion of laughter makes her laugh. That's a certainly, it's easy to imagine how that would happen for a young child, right? We don't even have the little color code next to us to know if yellow really does indicate laughter or whatever it might be. It totally could, though, right? And I think that's kind of the idea, is that these mood rings, we obviously all know they're kind of bullshit. But if you believe it to be true, then it very well could be. The mood ring later is brought up again because I think it turned purple, I believe it was, on Elliot and Alma's first date. And Elliot says, well, that means you're falling in love. And that's, a clever little pickup line, perhaps. It could be no more than that. But it was the power of suggestion. And obviously, it eventually became true. They did go on to get married. And so this is a movie that, yes, we are in search of all the answers. We want so easily to ascribe meaning to things like terrorist attacks and disease. We want those to kind of serve as neat and tidy explanations of these unexplainable happenings in our lives. And in some cases, they can, right? The pandemic, we eventually got to the bottom of it. We figured it out where it originated, how it happened, how we can solve it, and we are back better than ever as a result. I don't know about that last part, but sometimes we can't fully explain things, but that doesn't mean that we don't still want to believe in something. So we can be given these sort of like small victories, these small examples of belief that can bring us comfort, that can bring us closure. And that's really all we need, is to believe in something bigger than ourselves. And what is bigger than ourselves than the universe, than these forces that are beyond our understanding? That's not necessarily a religious doctrine, although, like Disclosure Day, that's a movie that is very much considering belief in the context of religion and outside of it. I don't think that's too far off from something like The Happening as well. As someone who, really does not resonate all that strongly with any organized religion, maybe I sort of appreciate that M. Night is using things like mood rings as kind of his metaphor for that idea. But nonetheless, I either way, I'm always intrigued by the notion of belief, and what it says about us as a culture, what we are and are not capable of believing in. And as we keep saying with Disclosure Day, it was very obvious that we as a society are not ready to believe in something bigger than ourselves, the way that film hopes to present at the very end. So I've just remained really fascinated by the sort of Rorschach test that film presents for all of us. And again, I hate to say it, I think a lot of you failed. I think a lot of you failed, but that's not me being dismissive of criticisms of the movie. I'm totally aware that the movie's not going to work for everybody, and it has some recognizable flaws that just don't gel with certain people's taste. But I do think that if you write off that ending as too improbable, too unrealistic, too disconnected from the world as you understand it, then you really are doing yourself and that movie, and perhaps all movies, a disservice. By pushing them that way. Because we want so badly for the world to be explainable, to be within our grasp. We want so badly for there to be an exact science. And to quote The Prestige, a Christopher Nolan film, exact science is very rarely an exact science. I hope I got that right. That's Nikola Tesla, David Bowie as Nikola Tesla in The Prestige, a movie I also maybe hope to discuss at some point. Perhaps post Odyssey will be Nolan pilled, all of us. I just want to keep talking about his movies. But I really like that dichotomy, actually, of quoting a Nolan movie in the context of this conversation about an M. Night Shyamalan movie, because it's actually interesting that that line exists in a Nolan movie, because I would almost argue that his entire project is attempting to turn all the unexplainable in life into an exact science. If you think about your own relationship with Christopher Nolan, you would probably agree. He's the guy that made superheroes serious, right? He made Batman, and he took Batman from the Joel Schumacher kind of colorful comic book, Tim Burton style, character, and he made it dark and serious, and he made it look like our world. We can fully wrap our heads around Batman now that we have the Dark Knight trilogy. The Prestige. This is a movie about magic. But what if magic could be understood? Now, I think The Prestige is kind of it's like, to use a word from that movie, and that I happen to be using a lot, I guess, in today's conversation. It's kind of the cipher to understand all of Christopher Nolan's work, in the sense that it's very much concerned with magic, perhaps the most unexplainable art form of them all, and it finds its filmmakers using the tools and the structure of magic tricks, to kind of pull off its own little bit of trickery and say something about illusion and deception in storytelling and in filmmaking, and how filmmaking is its own kind of magic, perhaps not a science, or is it, right? Because then look at Inception. This is about dreams. Dreams is one of the most unexplainable phenomena that we have in this world, and yet Nolan is trying his best to create a movie that can pick them apart and pull them apart and turn them into something of an exact science. I could keep going. Interstellar is a very, very researched movie about black holes, another sort of unexplainable phenomena in our universe. So it's interesting to compare Shyamalan, who's made a movie in The Happening that is pretty certain that we should always be uncertain because there is very little that we can be certain about. And to compare it to a guy like Nolan, who is interested in turning magic into science, who wants to explain all that cannot be explained. And it's interesting because I love both filmmakers. I love a filmmaker that is content to leave things up to chance, to leave things up to a kind of uncertainty, and a filmmaker who thinks that the sheer power of their artistry, they can arrive at a whole new set of answers. I think that's very interesting. That's kind of how I want to wrap up this conversation. As like I said, this sort of first batch of episodes is about a certain kind of film, a film that is concerned that we may not have all the answers, a film that thinks we have moved far, far away from one another and wants us to come back together as one. That is a film like Disclosure Day, like The Happening. So that's one kind of movie, right? But I don't think that movie is all that different from something like a Christopher Nolan film. I don't want to force the Odyssey into a box. I'm going to allow that film to be what it is, and I really hope that it lends itself naturally to some of the conversations that we're having here. And I'll eat my words if it doesn't. But there's a participatory nature to a Nolan movie. I think that is sort of the way to achieve a similar goal. So it depends how you want to come at it, right? Because his movies are these kinds of puzzle boxes, or perhaps more accurately, they're illusions, right? Like something like The Prestige really proves that ask you as the audience to pay close attention. Are you watching closely? They say in The Prestige. That film pretty much spoils its entire twist, its entire premise in the very first two shots of the movie. But you would never know it unless you're already watching closely. It's so clever. Again, I'll probably come back to that movie at some point as we dive a little bit deeper into Nolan and what I'm hoping to say about him in the context of pop culture. Because let's be real, he is the filmmaker of our times, right? He maybe even has surpassed Steven Spielberg, at least as far as the 21st century is concerned. So he's an important figure in this conversation for sure. And so if he also shares in the belief that we have lost something of a monoculture, he's trying to create it in real time by asking you to actively engage with and participate in the meaning-making process of his movies. And I think people respond to that a lot more positively than they do something like Disclosure Day, which I understand it pushed some people away. It didn't gel with how they view the world. And it didn't necessarily ask them to participate in that meaning-making process and decide for themselves. I think that your response to it, positive or negative, can still be a valuable one, and that you should not use that as a reason to write off the movie. Again, I think you might have failed the Rorschach test if you did exactly that. But either way, these are movies that are concerned with our ability to participate in the meaning-making process, are concerned with our ability to collaborate with one another, to bring our shared ideologies, our shared expertise together, and to really start to understand that which can be very difficult to understand, or to accept our limits as a population as well. I know this all sounds kind of pie in the sky. I'm always trying to bring things down to earth a little bit more here at CINTEGRITY, but I get too excited and I start talking in sort of broad philosophical strokes. So this may have been one of our messier episodes, but I hope you can see the bridge I'm trying to build from this first batch of episodes to what we have lying ahead of us. Like I said, maybe I'll pop on here next week and be like, actually, the Odyssey had nothing to do with any of that. Actually, Christopher Nolan is not the guy I thought he was, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this conversation about M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening. This is one that I've really enjoyed revisiting, and I hope that you all will as well. And so I want to end with another one of this movie's very awkward quotes, because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it really kind of sums up a lot of what the movie is trying to say. When Alma and Elliot hear, and their entire group, hear distant gunshots, suggesting that characters are now afflicted by the happening and are likely shooting at or killing themselves. Really upsetting stuff in this movie. Alma's freaking out. Elliot's thinking, he's like, give me a second, I need to think, I need to figure out a plan, I don't know what to do. He's kind of paralyzed. And she says, we can't just stay here as the uninvolved observer. That's such an awkward way to say, like, we have to do something, right? Like, I think that's the way a character would typically express that. We can't just stand here. We have to go help them. We have to do something. We can't just stay here as the uninvolved observers. I think there's a very good reason for M. Night to frame that the way that he does? Why does he use that particular phrasing? I sound like Brian Windhorst. Why does he use that particular phrasing? He does so because that's kind of the thesis of this movie. That there are things that are happening that we are not always privy to, that we can't always fully comprehend, but we need to be there for one another. We need to share our resources, share our ideas, our beliefs, all of that, because humanity is better off for it when that is the case. I think there's an argument that M. Night is probably a little more pessimistic, than Steven Spielberg, perhaps a little less convinced that we can get to that place. But his movies do have enough heart to them that I'm willing to say that perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps he does have some level of belief in our capacity for belief and collaboration and so on and so forth. So I say to you, we can't just stand there as uninvolved observers. I love that word uninvolved. It's just a weird word to use, but I do think it really sums up the kind of writing that M. Night likes to put into these kinds of stories. So let's get involved, right? Let's participate in the meaning-making process. And I hope for those of you who've already seen The Odyssey, you felt that movie allowed you to do so. Again, I do think Christopher Nolan is very good at inviting us into that process in a way that Shyamalan, who is a very twist-forward filmmaker, perhaps the way some of you may even view Christopher Nolan, I'll admit his movies aren't as participatory in that same way. I remember seeing Old a couple years ago, which I do actually think is a really good movie. And it kind of has this left field twist that while I do think adds a nice layer of meaning on top of the movie, it's not something that you could have seen coming. It's not something that you could have necessarily participated in arriving at or guessing at any earlier in the film. So there's a difference in that kind of style of filmmaking. And I do probably ultimately prefer Nolan's because participatory filmmaking I think is so crucial. I think in an age where a lot of us love games and video games and these kinds of things, that interactive filmmaking is an important thing. When I say interactive, I don't literally mean you need a controller in your hands. It can all be happening right up here. So, I've been telling everybody in my life, you can give me 3-word reviews of The Odyssey if you've seen it already. So I welcome those. I invite you to send me your 3-word review of The Odyssey, and I'll be back with my much longer, let's keep count of how many words I speak into this microphone when we talk about The Odyssey next week. Probably just a little bit over 3, if I had to guess. Thank you, as always, for listening to CINTEGRITY's Cultural Decay series. I'm Cory Stillman. This has been a conversation about M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening. Please, like I said, revisit that film. Let me know your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Stay tuned for a new newsletter this month as well. Talk to y'all soon.